So like I said, my name is Michael Withrow. I'm a director of solution architect at Twistlock, where we provide automated containerized security. Really what I want to give you everybody today is really a philosophical-based conversation on scaling application defense with intent-based security. Just give you guys a couple things to think about as we kind of go through. All right, so as you look at it, DevOps has changed everything. It's changed the world, right? But maybe a better way to look at it is DevOps has really significantly changed the security conversation, right? Before DevOps, what did you have? You had you had your DevOps teams, you had your operations team, you had security teams kind of working through things. Now that you introduce DevOps, really what you're kind of talking about is you have a dev team and a security team, right? As you kind of go through. DevOps means now you're deploying things much, much faster, a much, much greater rate of change as you're kind of going through. So really from a security perspective, that really introduced two key aspects as you kind of look at it. So, as you introduce DevOps, before the DevOps teams, traditionally, the traditional infrastructure team was managing the infrastructure, so to speak, right? Now with DevOps, that's moving over to the development teams. And then you introduce the rate of change that they're kind of bringing in, right? That introduces some fundamental challenges, right? Essentially what you're talking about is now with this adaptive change and this role that's kind of going through, what you have is traditional security models that are breaking that DevOps cycle that's kind of going through. And then to further complicate that, now you're introducing containers, this microservices into this monolithic type of model, right? And so how does all this work together? What does this really bring to the environment? And the reality is, and as I talk to customers as I go across the globe, talking to customer after customer, a real key theme comes in, really every customer that I talk through. I've been doing security for 20 years. Can I take my existing security principles, can I apply them to containerized technology? The reality is there's traditional security and there's new world security, right? And you really can't take those traditional mechanisms and apply them to containerized environments and reap the same benefits as you're kind of going through. You look at like blacklisting, ring fencing, all these kind of things like that. You look at, basically, hey, I have a 3-tier application, right? I got, a 2-node front end, a 2-node middle tier, and a 2-node database tier. In the federal government, as an example, we used to go through and everybody know the concept of cooking from a runtime perspective. You go through and cook on a tier, right, and go through and build stuff out. Work through the false positives, apply all this kind of stuff like that. Very rudimentary, very manual, intensive process as you're kind of going through. So that introduces, obviously, in the DevOps world, that introduces a heavy set of challenges, right, that I'll kind of talk through as we're going through. But really what it represents for an organization is a missed opportunity to improve your security posture, right? And the reality is when you look at containers, containers really bring in a set of characteristics which change the conversation. It's really what I'll dive into now. And you look at it, which really lends to new world security when I'm talking about containers. And so really when I talk about those 3 principles, everybody's probably heard these a couple of times, talking about declarative, minimal, and immutable from a containerized perspective. And so when you look at declarative, obviously you're talking about, hey, look, I'm building a Docker file, a Docker Compose file. The developer's going through and saying, this is my OS, this is my packages, my jar files, tar files, war files I'm injecting into there. Here's my network topology. And so now, whenever that Docker file is leveraged, every single time it's deployed, regardless of where it's deployed, it looks exactly the same, right? So when we say declarative, that's what we're talking about. And then obviously when we look at minimal, you look at a virtual machine, and bloatware and all this kind of stuff like that. Container by nature is designed to be minimal, right? So no longer am I building this middle tier and I got a 2-node middle tier and across that I got 25 applications supporting the front end and the back end, right? I'm going to thin that out and those 25 middle tier applications are now going to be 25 containers, right? As an example as I'm kind of going through. So I'm purpose built, very, very minimal, right? So this concept of bloatware, you're seeing an Alpine and Atomic and all these minimalistic footprints because now I'm just serving up whatever I need just to serve up the application. All this other OS bloat is not really necessary. And then, the most important point is this concept of immutability, right? So a container by nature is stateless, right? So really when I look at conceptually, what I'm talking about is that you don't patch or upgrade containers. You have a package that's out of date, you throw it away and you build another one, right? As you kind of go through from a philosophical perspective. And so really what this lends to is new world security, right? And so having the ability to run inside the development pipeline as they're kind of going through, right? So rather than adopting these traditional security models and then retooling them as they kind of go through, what you're really looking for is tools that can go through and automate this process. So as you look at it, it's very common to see that, hey, look, I got developers on their MacBook building these tar files, jar files, war files, right? And they're injecting them into a Bamboo CI or a Circle CI or Jenkins CI or whatever it might be. And then from there, it's getting pushed into a Artifactory registry or a DTR registry or whatever it might be. Then it's getting pulled from there and deployed into a Mesosphere cluster out in AWS or an ACS cluster or an ECS cluster or whatever it might be as you kind of go through. And so how do you keep control of that, right? And how do you look at that? So what you're looking for is tools that tie into the CI/CD pipeline process, right? Go through from a configuration perspective. So I can go through and orchestrate that change. So peering into the images that are going through the topology, going through and really saying, hey, look, as this image is being built, I can assess the state. I know what's going on from an image perspective. I know the vulnerability state, the compliance state. I can go through, peer into that as I'm kind of going through. All the way through the cycle. So as that image moves through the topology, right, I've now captured that intent, right? So I know what the intent is. And so now as that image moves through, I know exactly the state. And that's the important part of the conversation. So as you look at it, taking advantage of the images that's moving through, as proactive as you want to be, right? Maybe, like I said, down at that developer's MacBook, before they even inject it in the CI pipeline process, you can go through and grab that intent. So now as that image moves through the topology, now you can take advantage of that intent, and then now the metadata is associated. Now you're taking advantage of the immutable, the declarative, the minimalistic state, and then that's where that intent-based security comes in. Because now we know definitively it's not traditional-based security where it's defining the blacklist and then retroacting that back. Now it's the opposite. Now, because of that declarative state, I can effectively define a whitelist and then enforce that particular whitelist. And that's where the intent comes in, is really going through, starting at the Docker file, the Docker Compose file, from a very, very proactive perspective. Think SecOps from that perspective. So as that image is getting built, the metadata is associated. It's running in some Mesosphere cluster, some multi-cloud. Doesn't really matter, right? You know, based on the Docker file, the Docker Compose file, what's actually there. And that's where the operational intent comes in. Because of that minimalistic nature, defining that whitelist becomes a very trivial task. Compared to the traditional model, where, as an example, in the federal government, we would cook for 30 days and then still work through 70% false positives, right, as an example. So it was a very intrusive type of process. So as you look at containers, that simplifies that process exponentially. And your rate of accuracy goes up really, really twofold in that particular perspective. So you can see in a lot of cases 98, 99% accuracy from a whitelist perspective. Nothing's ever perfect. That's a rabbit hole you never want to chase, as an example. But it makes that conversation extremely easy compared to those traditional metrics that you're kind of looking at. And so as you look at it, right, and that's really the fundamental premise as you're looking at it, right? So a lot of conversations come up about, do I retool an existing application over in order to account for this particular capability, or how do they tie in? And so automation is the key term, right? So you've heard probably talks about SE Linux and all this kind of stuff like that. And there's a lot of different capabilities, right? But the really cool thing about containers and the real value prop about containers is a low level of effort, right? And taking advantage of that minimalistic declarative nature, right? And automating the entire stack, right? So you think static content analysis as the image is coming up, and then as it's rolling out, essentially capturing that operational intent and enforcing it, right? Is really where the value comes in from a capabilities perspective. So now, once we've defined that, the beautiful part about it is, it doesn't really matter if it's actual an attack, or if it's just something outside of the operational intent. The reality is, it's not part of the operational intent, so it must be an attack, right? And so if you define everything that way, you're at a much higher security posture than you were traditionally. And so simply, as you look at it, and then the real-world scale becomes in there, and really, as you look at it from, I've dealt with this at a lot of different customers, is, hey, look, we were going from 6-month builds, and now we have 10 images change on a daily basis, right, across 10,000 hosts. I have 100 developers globally stashed out. The rate of change is a very scary thing for a lot of organizations. That's one of the fundamental challenges that a lot of organizations have with containers, right? And so having a tool that can understand that is going to be a critical part of your path forward, right? And so it doesn't really matter what the development process is, doesn't matter where the image lives, doesn't matter where the image goes, where the container is running. Something that understands the ecosystem and can plug in the ecosystem is going to be a critical capability for you to achieve that holistic security that we're kind of talking about. And the cool part about it, from a capabilities perspective, is that really we're talking about this from a lower level of effort. And that's the really beautiful part when you look at containers, right? I don't know if a lot of people in this room, how far you're along with your containerized environment. But essentially, as you look at it, it's doing more with less, right? There's, with cloud technology and all this kind of stuff like that, moving from cloud to DevOps, from DevOps to containers and all stuff like that. The beauty of it is that with this rate of change, the beautiful thing is you don't need a stack of resources to do it, right? A lot of organizations that we're seeing are doing this with a low-level set of resources. So it's not like I have to build out a team of 6 or 7 security architects or whatever it is. That rate of change, we have customers with 10,000 containers, 500 hosts, those kind of things like that. Low level of effort as you're kind of going through. So I wanted to hit it really quick. So I didn't need a full 30 minutes. It was just really a thing to think about from a conceptual perspective as you kind of go through, not a product pitch, so to speak, as you're kind of going through. But as you look at it, that's essentially what we do out of the box from a capabilities perspective. So we go through as proactive as you can be from a capabilities perspective. We're going to peer into that development process. Developers building those jar files, tar files, war files, building to crack those things open, be very proactive, right? So we'll have customers go, hey, look, do I just need to plug in it in production, right? Well, the reality is you're very late from a security perspective. Now you're in reactive mode, right, from that perspective. Containers really afford you a really unique opportunity to heighten your security posture. One of the things that we always talk about conceptually as you're kind of going through is that essentially containers give you a unique opportunity to improve the security posture of your application. And so through intent-based security, that's essentially the base premise for how you do that, right? Before, with the monolithic traditional-based security models, you're talking about doing everything manually in a lot of different cases, right? Maybe you do Puppet or Chef or whatever it is, and you have CMDB boards. You have traditional security processes as I want to move this application from dev to staging to prod. Everybody knows the security gates that I have to go through, the control gates I have to go to, the length of processes, the approval processes you have to go through, right? But essentially, the beautiful part about this is automating that process and having real gates in there, automated gates that go through, and that's the key part, right? Is automating the generation of SE Linux profiles, right? The automation of generating the whitelist, the automated process of enforcing the capabilities. So what was scanned yesterday and was clean is not necessarily clean over here today, right? So how do I know that? How do I secure it? How do I prevent that from actually infecting my environment, right? And those are all, conceptually what you want to think about from a containerized perspective. You have multiple attack vectors. You look at vulnerabilities is one stack, right? As you kind of go through compliance, the operational organizational construct is another attack vector. Access control is another one, right? So API access in, Docker exec in, trying to do something. And then from our perspective, intent-based security is all about runtime, right? As you look at it. And the easy elevator pitch way to think about it is that what you're looking for is a capability that basically secures what gets built, secure how that gets deployed, and prevent what just got deployed from drifting. Right? And that's really what intent-based security is taking advantage from a proactive perspective, is defining what got built all the way in the dev stage, so by the time it gets to production, there's no questions.
On that note, thank you very much, Michael.
All right. Thanks, everybody.